Today we're at section 4.4 and the objective is to find the exact values of trig functions with given coordinates. So today we're going to assume that we're moving off of the unit circle, so the radius is no longer going to be 1. So one main thing that you need to have for your notes is the formula to find the radius. So x squared plus y squared equals r squared is a formula that we're going to be using very frequently, and again this is another thing that needs to be memorized to find the radius if you're given any x and y coordinate pair. And just a kind of quick refresher, sine is y over r, cosine is x over r, tangent is y over x, and then the rest are the reciprocals. So cosecant is r over y, secant is r over x, and cotangent is x over y. So we're going to get right into it. So assuming the point that is given is -3, -5, find each trig function. So notice you have an x and a y, what we don't have is r. So the very first thing we have to calculate is our radius. So I have a -3 squared plus a -5 squared, and we're trying to find what r is equal to. So I'll have 9 plus 25 equals r squared. So 34 equals r squared. Square root both sides. So r is the square root of 34. Now, obviously, if that broke down, I do expect you to break it down. However, 34 has no perfect square, so it will not break down. So we're going to go ahead and find our trig function. So we're going to start with sine. So sine is y over r. So I take my y value of -5 over the r value of root 34. Now we have to rationalize, and that means multiply by root 34, top and bottom. So I get -5 root 34 all over 34. Cosine of theta is x over r, so -3 over root 34. Again, rationalizing, that just bumps it up. So -3 root 34 over 34. And lastly, tangent is y over x, so when I divide my y by my x value, I get 5 over 3. And that should be pretty basic. If I asked for the other three trig functions, then you would just be taking the reciprocals. So I would like to kind of introduce the new part of this lesson. If you were in Algebra 2 last year, this is something you should have seen last year. So this is called the signs of the trig functions. Okay, so here is my quadrants. So I know that this is quadrant 1, this is quadrant 2, quadrant 3, and quadrant 4. And again, this chart is meant to identify to you what functions are positive in that quadrant. Not negative, just the positive ones. So in the first quadrant, my coordinate is made up of a positive x and a positive y. So if x and y are both positive, and r is positive because it's a radius, that means all functions are positive. And I'm underlining the a for a reason I'll explain in a moment. In quadrant 2, my coordinate has negative x's and positive y's. So y value is positive, so the trig function that deals with y is sine. If sine is positive, then its partner in crime or reciprocal is also positive. In quadrant 3, x and y are both negative. So the only way I would get a positive function here is if x and y are being divided by each other, because two negatives make a positive. So tangent is positive, which means it's reciprocal of cotangent. And in quadrant 4, the x values are negative, so that is my cosine. and of course it's reciprocal of secant. So I'm going to tell you the mnemonic that I use to remember this. You can take it or leave it or come up with your own. So the one that I learned was all students take calc. The one that's in the textbook that you have this year is a smart trig class. The one my students came up with a few years ago is all surfers tan constantly. So I don't care which mnemonic you use, but you just have to memorize that order so you know which trig functions are positive where. So let's do an example of the application of this. So the directions or the information that's going to say is if tangent of theta is less than 0 and cosine of theta is greater than 0, name the quadrant in which theta lies. So we're going to go back to this whole idea of drawing our coordinate out, and we're going to label all students take calc, or all surfers tan constantly, or a smart trig class. And now we're going to do some highlighting. So it says tangent is less than 0, so I'm looking for where tangent is negative. Remember, this chart is highlighting where these functions are positive. So tangent is positive in the first quadrant and the third quadrant. A stands for all, T stands for tangent. So that means tangent has to be negative in quadrant 2 and in quadrant 4. Then it says cosine of theta is greater than 0. So let me change my pen. Okay, so cosine is positive in quadrant 1 and in quadrant 4. And the answer is where the overlap of the shading is going to happen. So notice the overlap in quadrant 4. So that would be our answer. So let's try another one. So the scenario that's given now is sine of theta is less than 0 and cosine of theta is less than 0. So we have all students take calc, all surfers tan constantly, whatever. So it says sine is less than 0. So I know sine is positive in quadrant 1 and quadrant 2. But I'm not looking for where it's positive, I'm looking for where it's negative. So if it's positive in 1 and 2, that means it has to be negative in 3 and 4. Okay, and then next it says cosine is less than 0. So I know cosine's positive in 1 and in 4. But I'm looking for where it's negative. So obviously if it's positive in those two, it's negative in the other two. So cosine is negative in 2 and 3. So the answer, the quadrant where they overlap, would be located in quadrant 3. So that would be our answer. So we're going to pause for that today, and we're going to pick up with more examples tomorrow.